Let's see.
Has everyone had a chance to sign in on the sign-in sheet? We can pass it around.
Is this the first time you guys are doing it this way?
Second time. Okay, setup-wise, we're all good.
Great.
Should we go ahead and get started?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Well, welcome to the CCBBI workshop series, which is partnered with OnNeuro. Thanks for coming, and I hope your plates are full and your minds are ready for an interesting presentation. I guess, so you notice here there's a mic on the table, so you should be able to both hear everything that's happening, and she should be able to hear us.
Yeah, so at any time, if you just want to speak up or ask questions or anything, we have an extended discussion. We purposely told Anjali to give maybe a shorter talk so that we can have a more of a question and answering portion at the end. The microphone should pick up everybody fine, so don't worry about it. Anjali, you can tell us if there are any audio issues on your end.
I guess we'll pass it over to Ian, who's going to give an introduction.
Hi, Anjali.
Hi, Ian.
How are you doing? Thanks for joining us. So,
yeah.
I just want to give you a brief intro, dig up some dirt on you for them.
I'm sure you could find nothing.
So I've known Anjali for many years. So her and I were both postdocs together at Zurich, along with these fine folks. So she did her PhD at Toronto, where she worked with Randy McIntosh, working on lesion patients and people with brain damage, and then she joined Zurich about 6 years ago, Anjali?
Yes. Yeah.
And has been working with Todd Hare and Christian Ruff and these other postdocs, doing a lot of brain stimulation work, already looking at explore versus exploit trade-offs in learning. Some fun facts about Anjali. I think I forget exactly when, was it after grad school or before grad school, she worked for several months on a tall ship sailing around the Great Lakes.
It was more like 2 weeks, but yes.
Only 2 weeks, okay. I also have her to thank for my only ever trip to Oktoberfest in Munich. So anyways, I'm sure she's gonna give a great talk today on, also related to her work on exploring and exploiting and learning, but talking instead today about arousal and pupil dilation and the locus release norepinephrine system. So take it away, Anjali.
Okay, thank you, Ian, so much for the fun introduction, and thank you guys for inviting me. This is my first Skype talk. I think this is a really fun idea and really great way to access different labs. So I think it's really cool. And I'm not sure what everyone's background is, so just feel free to jump in at any time if something isn't clear during the talk too. I think that would just make it more interactive. But I just want to tell you guys a little bit about our research related to arousal and exploration exploitation. So something that is important to adaptive decision making is just managing these trade-offs between exploration and exploitation, where the idea is you either stick with something that you know or you invest time and energy into trying something new. So I just wanted to pick an example for you guys just to illustrate this. So several of my colleagues have been to Columbus and have raved about your lively craft brewery scene that you've got going on there. So does anyone really like a beer that's on this menu?
Yeah.
Anyone want to pick one that you really enjoy?
The wet musk of the Minotaur.
The Minotaur. Okay, so basically, if you just imagine you're going to go stop by Who Farted this evening, if you were going to stick with something you knew really well, you would pick the Minotaur and exploit. But potentially, you might also want to explore and try something new. This is something we do all the time. So you might then just go with, let's say, this tailpipe in just because you want to check out these Gewürztraminer white wine grapes. And there's a chance it might really blow your mind, might be really interesting. There's also a chance that you might really not like the white wine and the IPA combination. You might wish you would have just stuck and exploited. So this is a really simple example of what we're trying to get at. But balancing these trade-offs has been shown to be important for survival across species. For example, honeybees have to figure out exactly how much time they want to spend on one flower versus searching out and looking for another flower for pollen. And even organisms as simple as slime molds have to explore and exploit. So you can see on the bottom there, this would be the main, in terms of searching for food, this would be the main exploit branch for the slime mold, but occasionally it just has to shoot out and explore other areas for resources. And so balancing this trade-off also governs complex human behaviors like investing in the stock market. So we're really interested in looking at this just in decision-making in dynamic environments. So in terms of what we know about this neurally, something called the adaptive game theory links basically the locus coeruleus noradrenergic arousal system with regulating the trade-off between exploration and exploitation. So the locus coeruleus is basically just a little nucleus in the pons that sends noradrenergic projections throughout the neocortex. And what this theory basically suggested was that in macaque monkeys, there's a relationship between how the locus coeruleus fires during a target detection task and how well they perform on that task. So if you just look here, when the locus coeruleus is in what the authors called a more tonic mode of firing, which means sustained high-level bursts of activity, the monkeys were actually quite distractible and weren't really paying attention to the target. And the idea was that this mode maybe favored more exploration and was potentially actually adaptive because having this tonic burst of activity would motivate the monkeys to seek out better resources. Whereas most of the time during the detection task, the locus coeruleus was in the phasic mode, which just was short bursts of firing after the target, and the monkeys were very task engaged and potentially open to exploitation. A further aspect of this theory was that the authors hypothesized that potentially changes in the utility of the environment are actually what causes the locus coeruleus to shift between these modes of tonic and phasic firing. And the idea basically is that in this target detection task or in any kind of search task, you're receiving certain rewards from your environment, and occasionally the rewards are good, but sometimes the rewards over a longer time period kind of dip down and become not so good. And this is just what they theorized. They didn't have evidence for it, but they thought that if the utility was low over a longer period, that's actually when the locus coeruleus would kind of shift into this tonic firing mode, and that would promote the monkeys to go out and explore because they weren't receiving as good resources from the environment. And most of the projections from the locus coeruleus are throughout the neocortex, but the anterior cingulate as well as the orbitofrontal cortex are some of the few regions that actually have top-down projections back down to the locus coeruleus. So they suggested that potentially it was these regions that were tracking the utility of the environment and then feeding this information down to locus coeruleus and then causing these shifts between exploration and exploitation. So this was just a paper in macaque monkeys. There isn't really a lot of evidence in humans linking arousal and exploitation, so this is kind of what we wanted to look at in our study. In terms of what's been done looking at exploration in humans, there's been several Fmri studies that have, in fact, implicated the anterior cingulate in exploration, and basically this region is more active and correlates with the value of searching out the other option rather than engaging with your current choice. And also, frontal polar cortex has been shown to be encoding the probability of the action that you didn't choose. So your alternative course of action, how rewarding that is, has been shown to be encoded there. So like I said, we wanted to basically conduct a study using neuroimaging as well as pupillometry, which could look at arousal, to link at, decisions related to exploration or exploitation to arousal, and really try to find if there's any evidence for adaptive game theory in humans. So we had a couple of predictions that we wanted to test, which I don't know why it's showing up in gray, but basically we wanted to look at whether or not there's changes in arousal that can predict whether or not people will explore. So we hypothesized that arousal in the baseline, so basically when participants are not actually making decisions, but leading up to a decision, would be increased prior to an explore choice relative to an exploit choice, and that we might see similar activity increases in these brain areas that were previously implicated in exploration. And we also thought that, as adaptive game theory suggested, that this is going to be related to the utility of the environment. So we wanted to see whether or not arousal will be influenced by the changes in the environmental value differences that we would be studying. Then we wanted to test whether or not some of this is related to anterior cingulate, which was strongly hypothesized in adaptive game theory. So we wanted to see if increases in baseline arousal that we would see prior to exploration would somehow be linked to increases in activity in anterior cingulate cortex for exploration. And finally, we just wanted to see if these changes in arousal as well as neural activity during exploration is somehow going to be related to better or more adaptive decision making. So are the changes that we're observing going to actually predict participants doing better in a decision making path? So the way that we usually study exploration is through something called a Bandit Task. This is sort of the classic way to look at these trade-offs. A Bandit Task is basically involving 3 virtual slot machines named after the one-armed bandits in Vegas. And the idea is that they will give out randomly drifting reward probabilities. So here I'm just plotting an example of the 3 bandits that we had the participants playing. And so the idea is the participants have to learn where these reward probabilities are, or these reward magnitudes, and they have to identify the best paying option, which around trial 50 would be bandit number 2. But occasionally it's just in their best interest to explore and sample some of the other options to see whether or not they've increased in their value and potentially have become the new best option. So the way we classify on each choice whether or not the participant explored or exploited is we use a traditional reinforcement learning model, which basically just gives us estimates of how well the participants are learning the bandit values over time and how much they're adjusting based on their feedback that they're getting from the task. So you can see here plotted over the actual values in the background in the solid lines are the dashed values that we get for one participant, and this is their estimates of the values from these bandits over time. And the way we classify their choices is if they choose, according to their own learned estimates, the highest paying option, then we say, okay, they're exploiting, they're choosing what they know to be best. However, if they kind of take a gamble, they pick a bandit that they know is not necessarily the highest paying option, then we call that explore. And so this is how we sorted the choices during the task. And then what we did is we had these participants play this bandit task over the course of 300 trials, just basically selecting between these slot machines in the Fmri scanner. And we looked at their brain activity sorted by trial. So what's going on right before they explore, what's going on right before they exploit. And then we also took pupil measurements while they were in the scanner. So pupil measurements recently in monkeys have been shown to be correlated with tonic locus coeruleus firing. So the larger the pupil, the more tonic locus coeruleus activity there is, the more aroused participants are. And hopefully this is kind of like a proxy that we can get at for locus coeruleus firing. So what we did was we extracted this data from the entire run across the 300 trials, and then we z-scored within run because obviously people have different pupil sizes, and there's just differences in the estimates that we're getting based on eye tracking equipment. And then for each trial, based on whether or not it was an explore or an exploit trial, we just took the time series that was -2 seconds leading up to the start of the trial all the way up to 5 seconds post-onset. And like I said, this pupil diameter measure was our kind of proxy for locus coeruleus firing. And then we looked at our first hypothesis, which was that the baseline arousal as indexed by pupil diameter will be increased for exploratory choices. So if you look here, we have these pupil diameter curves, and the 0 mark here is the trial onset. And in the red, you can see the curves for the explore choices, and in the green for exploit. So we do, in fact, have some confirmation of this idea that arousal actually leading up to exploration is increased based on pupil diameter. So what we did then is basically use a window of 1 second prior to the onset, which we refer to as just pupil baseline. So the ITI for our experiment was quite long. It was almost 2 seconds on average between trials. So we could say that in this 1 second leading up to the trial, actually it was just that the subjects were fixating and there were no decision processes going on. This was after they had received feedback, but before they actually knew what when the next trial was going to start. So this should hopefully index tonic arousal that's just kind of a baseline endogenous arousal. We wanted to also test whether or not the relationship between PBL and exploration is independent of other measures that we know that predict exploration. So we conducted a logistic regression, and we looked at the relationship between PBL here and exploration choices across trials where exploration was just coded as 1. As you can see, PBL has a significant relationship to explore. So the larger the pupil baseline diameter, the more likely the participant was to explore, even when we control for some of these other measures that we know relate to exploration, like the value differences of the bandits, as well as we wanted to control for, is this just an artifact of the previous reward? So if you had a high reward previously, would this somehow be controlling the size of the pupil? But when we control for some of these measures, we still find a significant relationship. So next, we wanted to address the maybe more interesting prediction that falls out of adaptive game theory, which is that this is potentially happening over a long-term period. So we wanted to see, is there a ramping up in baseline arousal prior to when participants explore? And as you can see here, in fact, we see that there is. So in red, again, we have now this mean pupil baseline measure that's right before the trial onset, right leading up to explore choices. And in green, we have the same measure leading up to exploit choices. And we can see that there's actually a slow ramping up of the pupil, even though participants may not necessarily be exploring on the previous trials. So if we look at what they're doing on these previous trials, on the current trial, obviously red, they're exploring, but they're mostly exploiting on these previous trials. So they're basically selecting the bandit that they think is the best bandit, but the arousal system is already kind of gearing up or ramping up to make the switch. So this is just some idea that this is maybe encoding some evidence in favor of switching before the participants are actually making that choice. We also wanted to test the prediction that potentially what's happening before explore and exploit choices is linked to the utility of the bandits, which we define as the value of the highest paying option relative to the second highest paying option. And we can see, consistent with adaptive game theory, actually, that prior to explore choices in red, the utility or how much the bandits are paying you is quite depressed. So it's a low-paying environment, and potentially this is what's relating to the locus coeruleus switching to this tonic mode and people wanting to switch their behavior. So then we thought, we have fMRI data. We want to look at this similarly. What's going on in the brain? We can look at what's going on in the current trial, and we can also, again, see maybe some regions are showing a ramping up in activity before people actually explore. So we just did a standard fMRI task-based contrast where we compared explore trials relative to exploit trials prior to just the current trial. And again, we controlled for all of these decision variables like the utility of the bandits and the previous reward and the trial number. And so we replicate what we've seen before. We see frontal polar cortex is really strongly active right before you explore. We also see anterior cingulate and infraparietal lobule and anterior insula. And then we can go one trial back and we can see, even though a participant might have exploited on this trial, is there an area that's kind of ramping up, thinking about switching? And what we find is, in addition to precentral gyrus, that actually frontal polar cortex is the area that shows an increase in activity in a sustained manner prior to exploration. And this is, again, consistent with this idea that it may be tracking some kind of long-term behavioral evidence in favor of switching. And then we went to the second thing that we wanted to look at is just trying to link potentially some of the values that are changing in the environment to the actual arousal measure that we have in the pupil. And so we wanted to test whether or not the pupil is sensitive to some of the value differences, similar to what you would predict with adaptive game theory, that this information is being communicated to locus coeruleus. So we did a regression on the actual time series of the pupil, and what I'm plotting here are just the beta values of that regression. And what we regressed were the value differences of the highest and second highest paying option on the pupil diameter for explore and exploit trials. And so what we can see is, so here in the baseline period, there isn't really any sensitivity to the value differences prior to an exploit trial, but in the baseline period prior to an explore trial, we actually see that there's an increased sensitivity to the value of the highest paying option. So what this would suggest is actually when you're thinking about switching, you're maybe more focused on the bandit value that is not paying out as much, the one where the utility is depressed. Maybe you're just more aware of that, and you're potentially comparing that, at least the pupil is potentially comparing that to the second highest paying option to maybe decide if there is enough evidence in favor of switching. So then again, we're trying to tie it all together with the prediction of the adaptive game theory. Is this related to anterior cingulate? So we wanted to see that whether or not the changes in arousal are actually coupled to the anterior cingulate. So we've shown that the arousal is sensitive to the utility difference. Is it sensitive perhaps to the region that we would predict is tracking the utility in the environment? And so here we did a second level fMRI analysis where we took on the current trial all the areas that were more active for explore relative to exploit, and we just did a correlation to see if this is related to the changes that we observe in arousal for explore and exploit. And we find here, when we look in the anterior cingulate, that this area in the dorsal anterior cingulate actually has a linking between the neural activity for explore exploit and the changes in the pupil for explore exploit. So this kind of suggests that there is some coupling between the two. And then just finally, to our last hypothesis, is all of these changes that we're observing actually related to some kind of adaptive decision making? Because potentially, maybe these areas are just active because people have disengaged from the task, like adaptive game theory would predict, and they're just making more errors right before the task. So the way we looked at optimal decision making is that we just looked at it as a percentage of how many points you could earn on average per trial. So if you look here, if some ideal observer on every single trial were picking the best bandit available, that the frequency of points that they earn here would be what you see in green. Whereas if a decision maker were choosing completely randomly throughout the task, the points that they would earn you would see here in blue. And our participants have a range and fall somewhere in the middle in terms of how well they do. So on average, we would say that they were 65% optimal in terms of how much that they could earn. And we took this measure across all participants and we related it to arousal. And so what we just found is that the larger the separation in the pupil for explore exploit, the more optimal the participants were on the task. So suggesting that the more sensitive the arousal was to whether or not they were about to explore, just the better they were doing overall. And then we also looked at this again in the Fmri data. So just as a reminder, this area in blue is the area in the ECC that we found was linked to the changes in pupil for explore relative to exploit. And if we look across the whole brain, what are the areas that are more active for exploration that are also more related to this optimality measure, how well that they're doing? And we find, again, a lot of anterior cingulate activity. So the more sensitive these regions are in yellow to exploring relative to exploiting, the better the participants are doing on the task. So just to kind of summarize what we have talked about and what we're finding, some of our results are providing some novel evidence in humans for some of the central predictions of adaptive game theory, that pupil diameter is increased prior to exploration relative to exploitation, that this increase slowly ramps up even when participants are exploiting prior to the actual choice, and that arousal is sensitive to the utility in the environment in the sense that it is more related or sensitive to the highest paying bandit. Our findings also highlight the role of the frontopolar cortex in potentially accumulating evidence in favor of a behavioral switch, not just right before the switch, but over a sustained period of time. And then our findings also show that the anterior cingulate is important in terms of its interactions with the locus coeruleus noradrenergic arousal system, that this coupling is potentially related to initiating exploration. And finally, so all of this in terms of the sensitivity of both the neural activity differences for exploration and exploitation, as well as the arousal changes, is important for potentially promoting behavioral flexibility and eventual improved performance on the task. So I just want to thank my collaborators on this work, some of which have come to Columbus, and our sources of funding. And thank you guys for your attention, and I guess it's time for the question and answer session.
All right, thank you very much, Anjali. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question regarding the decision to explore or exploit. From what percentage of trials were people sticking with the highest value option, and what percentage were they then choosing one of the inferior two?
Yeah, there was a huge amount of variability. So some participants, it was as low as maybe 10%, and some it was 40% that they explore, but they predominantly exploit. So they're very good at figuring out what the values are on the task, and more occasionally they'll have these kind of one-off explore choices, and then they'll go back to kind of the modus operandi of exploiting. Okay. But there's a lot of variability.
Yeah,
and so hopefully some of these changes in arousal kind of can help explain that variability in the regression I showed you.
Yeah, so I was curious then, in those people who tended not to switch so much, did you still see that same pattern where their pupils would start ramping up and their brain activity would start changing when they did decide to explore? Or was that more just in the case?
Yeah, not this is across all the participants. So there's definitely a lot of variability when you look at the individual pupil curves. So some of them even show a switch in the opposite direction. But it's not related to how much they explore in terms of what the individual curve looks like. But yeah, across participants, you definitely see this. But it's too noisy to look at a single subject level.
Okay, thank you.
I would say. Yeah, thank you for asking about that. There's definitely a lot of individual variability in terms of what's going on with the
I'm actually curious if you have plans, or if one of your collaborators had plans to kind of further explore that individual variability, to try to predict the timeline of who's going to explore and when.
Right. Yeah. I just think it's like a bit too difficult to isolate on like a trial-wise level, but we definitely are looking at just doing a kind of auto-sample prediction measures to fit the data to one set of the subjects, and then see if you could predict with those weightings the exploration rate on another participant. But yeah, I don't think you can do it on a trial-wise level. That would be really interesting. But another thing I think that we've been looking at recently is just kind of breaking up the task. So, for example, you probably would imagine that at some points in the bandit values, it's more beneficial to explore. Let's say you're right after a switch, or let's just say the environment is very volatile. And what we do find there is if you break it into little segments, the amount that people explore is linked to just the pupil adjustment for that particular section. So it's definitely a flexible mechanism that changes throughout the task. So if you explore more, then your pupil adjusts accordingly, and this is related to some of the parameters governing how exploratory your behavior is during the task.
I guess another question, and more of a theoretical one on how exploration and exploitation relate to approach and avoidance behavior. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm remembering, so in that bandit task, you are given information about all of the bandits after every trial, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
no, sorry, actually, no, that's not correct. You were only given information about the one that you actually chose.
Oh, I see.
And then we assume in the model that you update it with basically a drifting process. So you just assume some kind of bandit drift values in the ones you didn't sample, and you're only updating the one that you selected.
I see. Yeah. So I guess what are the theoretical parallels between approach and avoidance and exploration, exploitation choices?
Well, there's definitely a couple studies in rodents looking at just these go, no-go loops in the basal ganglia, and relating that to exploration or exploitation. That they're coupled, that they're more active. The no-go loops are more active when you explore, and the go sort of approach is more related to exploitation.
Okay, so maybe just kind of underlying or approach and avoidance kind of underlies some of these decisions. Would that be correct to say?
Yeah, I mean, we're not giving them any kind of loss or any kind of negative stimulus. But one thing that we do see is that if you look at the prediction errors, because you could just ask in our task, are you going to explore because you previously had a really positive prediction on an explore choice, or are you going to explore because you had a negative outcome, worse than expected, on an exploit choice? And what we find is it's actually the disappointments or the negative outcomes on the exploit choices that drives to explore. So I guess that would kind of loosely map onto avoidance. Is more of a driver of exploration than approach of the alternative option.
So this might be a little bit tangential, but when you're doing these studies and you're dealing with differences in firing and legislative decision making, do you think that these participants are cognizant of the decisions they're making, or that their brain makes decisions and they're able to kind of put it into words after?
Wow, that's a deep question. I mean, so I guess the whole idea with the adaptive gain theory is it's not like endogenous fluctuations of arousal. It's not like, oh, okay, you're just somehow having like an internal change in the locus coeruleus firing pattern. Like, it's clearly predicted to be driven by your assessment of the environmental utility difference, and that sort of pushes you into one or the other modes. So it is kind of more of a top-down influence from the ACC. So it does seem like it would be more of a cognizant effect on whether or not you want to explore. Just simply related to your assessment of the utility decreasing over time. Now, if anyone would put that into words, when we debrief people, ask them, did you explore more because you noticed that the values were going down? Maybe that's something we could have gotten more at, but theoretically, it should be because of their own assessment of how badly the environment is doing.
I'm going to ask a question with the caveat emphasizing that I'm not familiar with a lot of this type of work, but I'm just curious if, well, since you're talking about reward, I'm just wondering if would there be any differences in, and this isn't something we looked at yet in the studies that you presented, but if you were to look at potentially like functional connectivity, looking at differences between explore versus exploit behavior, do you think one, like, just wondering what some of your predictions might be? Because when I think about this like explore versus exploit, like reward seeking type behavior, the regions that usually come to my mind are like in the memory regions, like striatum, and I was kind of wondering, I'm just curious as to what you thought about.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the previous studies have shown this. So we didn't really look at functional connectivity, but there's definitely an increase in just functional connectivity between frontal polar cortex and inferior parietal sulcus prior to exploring. And then the original paper that looked at this, definitely like the exploitation regions are the reward-seeking regions. So VMPFC and ventral striatum. I imagine the connectivity would be increased between those areas before exploiting, but no one's directly looked at that. But yeah, definitely, it's the reward-based regions versus maybe more of this seeking out alternative courses of action and like evaluating the value of choosing to explore.
Has any study like this been done on people who are suffering from or prone to addiction to see if their rates of choosing the same versus exploring are different?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I think you would predict that in just an increase in exploitation, given that you might have sort of difficulty to find the optimal point to disengage. But there aren't really studies looking at that. We have done a study just looking at dopamine agonists, but unfortunately we didn't find any relationships there. But actually, you would predict that if you had increased dopamine receptors in the prefrontal cortex based on a genetic study looking at differences in the COMT gene polymorphism, that the more increased receptors you have there, actually the more likely people are to explore. So I think it would be hard to predict what exactly would happen in addiction. I guess that, yeah, if you have decreased dopamine receptors, then you would be more likely to exploit or overexploit. But I'm not aware of anyone that's looked at that.
More of a low-level question about the task, but so in the Bandit Task, you said they have 3 options. I was just wondering, so what is like the difference in terms of like the amount of reward you can receive from like the highest amount versus like the full amount?
I mean, range, like, so they basically drift between 0 and 100. And then it can range anywhere from, we made, anywhere from just overlapping to, I guess, 40 or so. Yeah, I mean, the ranges can be quite large.
I guess kind of following up on that, would you expect different results if the bandits actually became like aversive in nature? So, not just, oh, I'm disappointed I didn't get as much as I would have liked to, but, oh, this is actually taking value away from me.
Yeah, no, that would be really interesting to look at because I think a lot of this is like predominantly exploitation based in order to seek out a reward. So if you were constantly avoiding a loss, I would expect it to be different mechanisms, but I'm not really sure how. And I think that would be something really interesting to look at, just to see, because you're basically having to sort of engage some of these maybe more insular regions and maybe more aversive regions. So I don't think anyone's looked at that, and I think that would be a really cool thing to do. I imagine arousal would still be similarly implicated in the sense that it would be increased when you would want to switch from one bandit to another. But in terms of the valuation, I think different regions would probably be involved.
So in the task, they had only 3 options to choose from. What would you say? What would you say about the results if they had, like, I don't know, more than 3 options, 8, many options?
I think like then you're just, I mean, basically, I think if you get 3 or 4, the results would be very similar. But I think if you had 8 or so, depending on how you arrange the values, there would just be so much uncertainty about the different values. So I think it would be very difficult to get very stable estimates of the rewards. So you would have to really structure the task that they would be uncorrelated, and I think you would have to have a lot of trials so that the participants could actually learn the rewards and keep them in mind. Obviously, like, memory is involved a lot in this task, so it would just eventually become a problem in terms of just being able to track all of these rewards. But I think the fundamental mechanisms in terms of which regions would be involved in tracking all of these bandits would be very similar. It just would be a lot noisier.
Including the individual differences, so people that would explore more, would you say they would still explore more?
That's a good question. I think it depends on why they're exploring. So that's something we've tried to get a handle on. So in our model, we have just the inverse temperature parameter, which is the sense of like how noisy their choices are, and there's potentially random exploration that's driving the behavior of some individuals more. And then there's also this bonus that you assign to the uncertainty of the bandit. And so both of these relate to the pupil measures, but I think if you had a lot of bandits, I think your exploration would primarily be governed by the random exploration, because you really wouldn't have very, very stable estimate of the uncertainty in that in order to influence your decision. I mean, you'd have to kind of rank order the bandits based on how uncertain you were about their magnitudes, and I think that would just become too challenging, and I think it would just devolve more into just the random exploration.
Would you expect that there might be?
I think the relationships to uncertainty that we see in people would break down, which I didn't show you, but we see.
Would you expect that there might be individual differences in like group evaluation depending on, I guess, lifestyle preferences of the participants? Like, say you had a gambler, do you think that they would be less aroused by the task than somebody who was not inclined at all toward gambling or anything like that?
Right. I mean, definitely. I definitely think that in general, I I would predict that they would be more aroused by the task. It's just, would they be more aroused only? I would think they would be more, the people would just be more sensitive during exploit trials, not necessarily the value of exploration. It really would depend on the reason that that person is primarily exploring, which in general is more based on either randomness in order to just get information about the bandits. So given that it's more of an information-seeking type behavior, a gamma would probably not have this increased difference in the people between exploration and exploitation. I think they would just have like a higher response to just the rewards in general, but not the separation between the trial types. But I mean, that would be really interesting to look at some of these individual differences just to see if they could predict anything in terms of information seeking versus reward seeking. We do kind of look at some questionnaires. We really didn't find any relationship there, but in terms of like sensation seeking, which is kind of what we would think predicts exploratory behavior, we didn't find a relationship.
I was wondering, given that you can sort of predict when people are going to be more likely to explore or exploit, you could theoretically create the worst possible bandit for that individual person, where it changes at the exact moment where they're about to explore more. Do you think that, do you think that that's possible to sort of, it would kind of look at causal mechanisms a bit more, but do you think that that would change people's baseline wanting to explore and exploit in that environment as well?
Well, it would be kind of a learning task within a learning task, right? Where that if we had like some way to read out from the pupil, okay, they're thinking about exploring, and then we switch it on them. I think that, you know, it would just become kind of an additional learning feedback loop, and potentially, I think what would happen just would be that you would not want to have this arousal response because you would associate that with all of a sudden the bandit becoming, reacting to you and becoming worse. So one thing we are interested in looking at is we want to eventually do a neurofeedback study with this, where we see if we can like train potential, but this is not necessarily interacting with the task, but that would be a great idea. Just if we train the ACC frontal polar cortex interactions, can we get people to explore more or less? So we could feasibly have something that we read out the signal of the pupil or potentially ACC and have that like feedback into the bandit values and then have that go worse and see. But I think what would happen is you would just get this closed loop and you would just start to tamp down any activity that led to lower rewards. And it would just become a different task, but it would be really interesting to at least see if we can kind of influence like people's behavior on a more dynamic level, not training, but just saying, okay, we're going to give you feedback that's going to potentially maybe increase the values and see if they explore more. That's a great idea. I think given that we are interested in neurofeedback, that is something we could look at.
Yeah, neurofeedback sounds really cool. And just to sort of follow up on that, you're talking about neurofeedback in the scanner, but you could also just do it based on behavioral eye tracking.
Right.
How different is the data between the pupil data and the Fmri data? Do you think it would produce similar strong results outside of an Fmri study to do that sort of
thing? The Fmri data is that's a good question, but I think it's definitely less noisy. But of course, we're kind of like looking at the combined whole brain activity signal, and we in the real time setting kind of can regress out parameters that we know are contributing to that noise, such as emotion, and well, we don't do breathing or heart rate, but we do regress out motion in terms of the real-time feedback. And the pupil, I think that would be just much harder to clean up in any kind of real-time setting. I just think it's just way too noisy compared to the Fmri data. But potentially you could just look at this in like a near real-time sort of way. When you look at someone's kind of arousal levels over a period, we see these changes in arousal over maybe 30 seconds or so. Maybe we could look at that. But I think in general, we would have much better success getting the feedback from the Fmri signal, given that we can clean it up and we have a lot more data in terms of just the number of voxels that we can look at, and we can also dynamically adjust that data. We can look within like a search space in the ACC, and we can update and find the sphere within that that's more linked to FPC in a dynamic manner, and you can't really do any of that with the people. It's just one measure, so I think it would be more challenging.
So you were talking a little bit about how the FPC is kind of discriminating in some ways between the first best and the second best bandit.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you've attempted any multivariate approaches to see if both are being represented simultaneously, or if you would even expect that.
Right. No, we haven't done that, but I think that actually your woman, who's someone who looked at the FPC, has a study that actually shows, I don't remember if it's FPC, but it shows that you actually, I think it was FPC, ahead of time can dissociate not just the choice bandit, the explore or exploit option, but actually the bandit identity. So the bandit that you like, if you're going to choose number 1 or number 3, he was able to show that with MVPA before the actual choice. So I think, yeah, that's definitely something that you will be able to expect in terms of the fact that it's kind of thinking about the bandit that you want to switch to.
We have time for one more question, if anyone has a question.
What do you see as like the practical influences for this? Like I don't know, I'm looking at this and I just see like a lot of like possibilities of like different like high track and that. What do you guys see?
Artificial intelligence. I mean, right now, I think for us, like the real focus is just the basic science mechanism. I don't think we're trying to like figure out people's thought patterns or anything, but I do think it is potentially a very useful mechanism to try to predict choice behavior over a longer period. Because with Fmri data, we just don't see it going as far back. So I wouldn't see any kind of like thought reading possible, but just to get if we had like an online measure of this, we could maybe get a sense of, well before someone switches, someone maybe has a motor switch. I would think you would maybe be able to predict that from the people better than from any of the brain activity data. So I think that would be kind of cool just to get a better sense of in terms of people's movement and search patterns. Where are they going to go? Are they going to keep going straight? Or are they going to switch? I think that would be kind of a nice application.
Okay, thank you very much, Anjali. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you
for all your thought-provoking questions, and hope some of you had to go farted.
It's delicious.
Yeah, I would love to go someday.
Yeah, whenever you're in town, reach out and we'll take you there.
Yeah, okay. That sounds pretty awesome. Definitely the offices are like they have a really good time. So.
Yep.
Right.
So thanks everyone for coming. And I just wanted to give a quick update about OnNeuro. We have another talk scheduled on November 30th. We have an applied psychologist, Aditya Shukla from Pune, India, who'll be presenting. That's not part of the CCBBI, but if you join the mailing list on onneuro.com, you can be updated about that. And if you're not on the CCBBI email list, definitely do that so you can be aware of next year's meetings. And thank you all for coming. All right.
Thanks.
Bye, Anjali.
Bye.